For most of this war, Moscow slept fine. The sirens were for other cities, other people, somewhere far to the south where the maps were shaded in red. And then, overnight, 350 drones came for the capital, and by dawn, all 4 of Moscow's airports had gone dark. Debris was smoldering in a village 25 miles west of the Kremlin, and 3 people were dead in a place most Russians had never heard of before that morning. That was the night of July 12th into the 13th. And here is the part that matters more than the wreckage. The drones didn't have to level Moscow to change something. They only had to arrive. Because the moment the war reaches the city where the money lives, the whole calculation shifts. And I want to walk you through exactly why. Because it runs straight into your fuel tank and your grocery bill in ways the headlines are not connecting for you yet. This is Professor Alex. If you follow Markets Colliding with Geopolitics, subscribe and stay with me, because this one has layers. Let me show you the first one. Start with what actually happened, because the truth is more interesting than the exaggeration. Moscow's air defenses mostly held. The mayor said the bulk of those drones were knocked down at distant approaches, dozens more brought down as they closed on the city, and Russia's defense ministry put the night's total at 342 drones destroyed across the country and occupied Crimea. So no, the capital was not overrun. What died that night were civilians in a village called Pionersky and a woman in the Belgorod region near the border. That's the human cost, and it's real, and it's grim. But strip away the noise and look at the pattern underneath, because the pattern is the story. This was not one bad night. This was the latest beat in a rhythm Kyiv started deliberately in late June, when Zelensky announced what he called a 40-day pressure campaign. Long-range strikes aimed squarely at the Russian economy rather than the trenches. He said it plainly in an interview this week. When it's 100 drones over Moscow, Putin barely notices. When it becomes 1,000, he starts to feel the war in the one place he assumed was safe. That's the doctrine. And the reason it works has almost nothing to do with the drones that get through, and almost everything to do with what those drones have been hitting for the past 2 weeks. Because while the world watched Moscow, the quieter campaign was landing where it hurts. Refineries. On July 6th, Ukrainian drones reached the Gazprom Neft refinery in Omsk, the largest in Russia, roughly 2,500 kilometers from the front. Sit with that number for a second. That's the distance from New York to Denver, and a fleet of cheap aircraft crossed it and put fire on the single biggest fuel-producing site in the country. A refinery that processes more than 20 million tons of crude a year, and it had never once been touched by a Ukrainian drone since the invasion began, until it was. Then it kept going. Oil depots in Tver, at a facility called Krasnaya Zvezda, and in Stavropol, where reservoirs caught fire and residents were evacuated from apartment blocks nearby. A pumping station near Ufa, deep in Bashkortostan, close to 1,500 kilometers out. A marine loading terminal on the Rostov coast at Bataisk. The Ilsky refinery down in Krasnodar, one of the larger plants in southern Russia. A terminal in Taganrog, a depot in Azov, the Novatek complex at Ust-Luga on the Baltic. If you plotted all of it on a map, you'd see a country being struck across nearly its entire width, from the Baltic Sea to western Siberia, and you'd understand why Russian air defense, which is genuinely capable, keeps letting a few through. You cannot be strong everywhere at once. Stretch a shield across 11 time zones and there will always be a seam. Ukraine has spent 2 years learning where the seams are. Ukraine's general staff now claims it has knocked out something like 43% of Russia's refining capacity and puts the cumulative damage to the industry at more than $13 billion since last August. I want to be careful there because those are their numbers, and their numbers have a job to do. Independent energy analysts put the real functional damage closer to a third. But a third of a country's ability to turn crude into usable fuel is not a rounding error. A third is the kind of hole you feel at every gas station in the nation, and Russia is feeling it right now. And notice the phrasing the Ukrainians used on the Omsk strike. They called it the last of the 11 largest gasoline producers in the country to be hit. The last. As in, they've now reached all of them. That's not a random spray of attacks. That's a target list being worked to completion. Here's how you know it's real, and not just wartime boasting. You don't ban your own exports for fun. On July 8th and 9th, the Russian government did something that tells you more than any battlefield claim ever could. It banned the export of diesel. All of it. Producers included, not just the traders, a full shutoff running through the end of July, and the stated reason was to keep enough fuel at home. Think about what that admission costs Moscow. Russia is one of the largest fuel exporters on Earth. That export revenue is oxygen for the war budget, and they chose to cut off the oxygen rather than let their own drivers sit in lines that were already stretching for hours across more than 40 regions and into occupied Crimea. Their refining throughput has reportedly fallen to the lowest level since 2005. Putin is now talking about subsidizing fuel in Crimea, which is a strange sentence to write about a peninsula he annexed as a trophy. That's not the language of a country in control of its fuel market. That's the language of a country rationing. Now here's where I need you to slow down, because this is exactly where most of the coverage goes wrong, and getting it wrong will cost you money if you're trying to read the market. There are two energy stories running at the same time this month, and they are not the same story, even though they keep getting blended into one scary headline. Watch this carefully. Story 1 is crude oil, the global benchmark, the number you see on the news. And crude has been climbing again. Brent pushed back up above $80 this week, sitting around 82, 83, after falling below 70 at the very start of the month. But that climb is not about Ukrainian drones. That climb is about the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump moved this week to reimpose a blockade on Iranian vessels using the strait and to slap a 20% charge on other cargo passing through, roughly $32 million for a single supertanker, which is a staggering jump from the couple of million Iran used to charge for transit. That came on the back of U.S. strikes on more than 80 targets inside Iran, and war risk insurers quietly telling ship owners to think twice before sailing a fifth of the world's oil through a waterway that suddenly has American and Iranian forces trading blows around it. That's the crude story. It's a Middle East story wearing a Ukraine headline. And to really see how separate these two threads are, remember where crude was just a month ago. Earlier this year, when Hormuz was actually closed, from late February until a U.S.-Iran understanding reopened it in mid-June, Brent didn't sit at 80. It blew past $126 a barrel. That was a genuine oil shock, the kind that reorders the global economy, and then it faded almost as fast as it came, dropping back under 70 by the 1st of July as tankers started moving again. So the recent bounce back into the low 80s is not a new shock. It's the aftershock of the old one, flaring up because the ceasefire that calmed everything down is looking shakier by the day. The government's own energy forecasters actually cut their outlook for crude, projecting Brent around $74 for this quarter and drifting towards $65 next year, which tells you the smart money does not, at this moment, expect crude to run away to the upside on its own. The crude story is a story about Iran, and it could go either way depending on whether those tankers keep crossing. Story 2 is diesel, and that one is Ukraine's fingerprints all over it. When you knock out a third of Russia's refining and then Russia yanks its diesel off the export market, you don't just hurt Moscow. You tighten the entire global market for the specific fuel that moves everything. And the numbers have gotten strange. The margin refiners make turning crude into diesel, the crack spread, hit a record on July 8th, something above $64 a barrel on the key U.S. benchmark, a level with no real precedent in the modern market. European low-sulfur gas oil reached a record premium to crude of more than $60 a barrel, another figure the market had simply never printed before. And here in the States, the Energy Information Administration reported that distillate inventories, which is diesel and heating oil, fell by 5 million barrels in a single week, dropping to around 103 million barrels, roughly 12% below their 5-year seasonal average. Here's why that specific number matters, and I want to make sure this lands. Analysts surveyed before that report had expected inventories to build by nearly 1 million barrels. Instead, they drew down 5 million. That's a swing of almost 6 million barrels between what the market braced for and what actually showed up. Traders had positioned for a cushion. They got the opposite. And when the market is leaning one way and reality shoves it the other, that's when prices move fast and people get hurt. The surprise matters more than the raw number. It tells you the tightness is real, not theoretical, and it's arriving faster than the professionals expected. Now layer in the timing, because the timing is almost unfair to Moscow's opponents in the market. One commodity strategist called Russia's diesel ban arriving at almost the worst possible moment. Why? Because earlier this year, when the Strait of Hormuz was effectively shut, the United States became the reliable diesel backstop for Europe and Britain, American barrels rode to the rescue. But every barrel the U.S. now sends toward Europe or Latin America is a barrel not sitting in a domestic tank. So you have American diesel being pulled in multiple directions at once, into a market where Russian supply just vanished, at a moment when U.S. stocks were already thin. That's not one squeeze, that's 3 squeezes stacked on top of each other, and they're all landing in the same few weeks. So why should someone in Ohio or Texas care that a refinery in Omsk is on fire? Here's the chain, and it's short. Diesel is the bloodstream of the American economy. It's not the fuel most people put in their car, but it's the fuel in the truck that brought everything to the store, the tractor that planted the field, the locomotive that hauled the container. When diesel gets tight and expensive, that cost doesn't sit still. It rides freight surcharges into the price of food, into building materials, into anything that has to be moved, which is essentially everything. So a drone campaign 2,000 kilometers inside Russia, aimed at Putin's war chest, ends up leaning on the cost of a bag of groceries in a suburb of Dallas. Not dramatically, not overnight, but persistently, at the exact moment American distillate stocks are already thin. That's the connection nobody's drawing for you, and it's the reason this stopped being a foreign war story and became a domestic cost story. Let me pull back up to altitude because there's a strategy underneath all of this, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Look at where Ukraine has been striking beyond the refineries. Tankers. Not warships, tankers. Ukraine's military says it has hit somewhere between 12 and 21 vessels in the Sea of Azov across recent nights, ships they describe as part of Russia's shadow fleet, the aging, reflagged, quietly insured tankers Moscow uses to move oil around Western sanctions and to keep fuel flowing to occupied Crimea. Think about the economics of that for a second because it's brutal in its simplicity. A shadow fleet tanker is worth tens of millions of dollars and takes years and a web of intermediaries to replace. The drone that lights it up costs a tiny fraction of that. This is the cost asymmetry that defines the whole campaign. Cheap machines destroying expensive things. A country that produces millions of drones a year, spending pennies to burn down assets that Russia measures in millions. You cannot win a long war when your enemy can trade a few $1,000s for a few million, over and over, night after night. And that arithmetic is now the quiet engine of this entire phase. And look at where those tankers matter most, because it isn't random water. It's the approach to Crimea. For years, the peninsula has been Russia's showpiece, the trophy of the whole war, and Ukraine has been methodically working to isolate it, going after the ferries, the fuel shipments, the logistics that keep it supplied. When you burn the tankers feeding Crimea, and you burn the refineries feeding the tankers, you're not just raising the price of fuel in Russia. You're slowly strangling the supply lines to the one piece of ground Putin cannot afford to lose, or even to appear to be losing. That's why Moscow is now talking about subsidizing fuel there. A trophy that needs a subsidy to keep its cars running is a trophy that's starting to cost more than it's worth. And everyone in the Kremlin can do that math. And that's before the West opened its wallet. This is where it tips from a Ukrainian operation into something larger. On July 12th, Reuters reported that Germany is financing the purchase of 50,000 strike drones for Ukraine, an order worth around 90 million euros, roughly $103 million, one of the biggest single drone buys any Western government has made for Kyiv. 50,000. And these aren't crude hobby aircraft. They're Shrike first-person view drones, built by a major Ukrainian manufacturer, carrying autonomous targeting software from an American defense tech firm, the kind that locks onto a moving target in the final seconds of flight when a human pilot would lose the signal. One version of that drone recently topped the leaderboard in a Pentagon-run competition, tied to a program worth over $1 billion to buy hundreds of thousands of one-way attack drones. So the same aircraft Germany is funding for Ukraine is the same class of aircraft the U.S. military is racing to stockpile for itself. That's not a coincidence. That's the world realizing, all at once, that the cheap drone is the weapon of the decade. And the software company at the center of it says it's helping deliver 100,000 drones to Ukraine this year across multiple hardware partners, financed by several Western governments, including a Pentagon contract for 33,000 that's reportedly already been delivered. The United Kingdom has committed to 150,000 drones this year inside a package worth over $1 billion. And here's the piece that should make Moscow genuinely uneasy. Britain has been developing what are called ITAR-free long-range weapons, cruise missiles built deliberately without American components, and the reason that matters is control. When a weapon contains U.S. parts, Washington gets a veto over where it goes. Strip out the American parts, and London can hand those missiles to Ukraine whenever it decides to. No permission slip required. One of those systems, a missile drone with an 800-kilometer reach and a 300-kilogram warhead, went from design to demonstration in 9 months. 9 months. The West isn't just funding this campaign anymore, it's industrializing it. So step back and hold the whole board in your head. Ukraine is burning a third of Russia's refining capacity. Russia has banned its own diesel exports and is rationing fuel at home. Global diesel margins are at records. American distillate stocks are thin. Europe is financing tens of thousands of autonomous drones. Britain is building missiles specifically so it can give them away. And crude is climbing on a separate Middle East crisis entirely, which means Russia isn't even getting the one thing that usually saves it when the West squeezes: a windfall from higher oil prices to plug the budget hole. Because here's the cruel twist for Moscow. Higher crude should be good news for a petrostate. But when a third of your refineries are down, you can't process the crude into the high-value fuel where the real money is. You're stuck selling the raw barrel at a discount while the profitable part of the business sits behind a wall of smoke. Rising oil prices, and Russia can't fully cash the check. That is a genuinely uncomfortable position, and it's new. Now, I'll be honest with you about the parts that are murkier because I'd rather you trust me than hype you. There's a lot floating around online right now about cracks inside Russia. Talk of unease among elites, rumors about Putin's health, claims about what ordinary Russians are searching for on the internet. I'm not going to build a case on any of that because none of it is confirmed, and I've watched too many analysts embarrass themselves reading tea leaves about the Kremlin's inner life. What I can tell you is grounded and verifiable. The fuel lines are real. The export ban is real. The airport closures are real. The refinery fires are real, tracked by satellite. You don't need the rumors. The receipts are enough. And the receipts point somewhere specific. Look at the diplomacy stacked on top of the strikes. Just days before all this, NATO met in Ankara and pledged around $80 billion in defense aid to Ukraine for 2026. Trump met Zelensky on the sidelines, and the tone was a world away from that ugly Oval Office blow-up back in early 2025. This time Trump praised him and pledged something Kyiv has begged for since the war began: a license to manufacture Patriot air defense systems on Ukrainian soil. Read that alongside the drone campaign, and a picture forms. Ukraine gets to make its own shield while it sharpens its own sword. And the man who spent months positioning himself as the deal-maker who'd end this war is now signaling he'll back a sanctions bill targeting the buyers of Russian oil. The pressure isn't coming from one direction anymore. It's coming from the sky over Moscow, from the fuel market, from Brussels and Berlin and London, and now, more openly, from Washington. But let me complicate my own story, because a good analyst argues with himself. None of this means Russia is collapsing. I want to be precise, because the word collapse gets thrown around, and it's usually wrong. What we're watching is strain, real and mounting, but strain is not the same as failure. Russia has absorbed enormous punishment for years and kept fighting. The diesel ban is temporary, set to expire at the end of the month, and Moscow has strong reasons to lift it fast, because foregoing export revenue is its own kind of wound. The refineries can be repaired, slowly, at cost. And a country that size, with reserves that deep, does not break because it had a hard fortnight. So don't let anyone sell you the fantasy that this is the end. It isn't. What it is a war that has finally started to cost Russia in the currency Putin cares about most: money, and the comfort of his own capital. And that's a different and more durable kind of pressure than any single battlefield swing. And that brings me to the question I keep circling back to, the one that actually matters for anyone watching this with skin in the game. For 4 years, the assumption baked into every market, every energy forecast, every risk model was that this war stayed contained, that it stayed over there, that it stayed a line on a map. That assumption is quietly breaking. Not because Moscow fell, it didn't, but because the war has learned how to travel. It travels up a drone's flight path to the capital. It travels through a diesel crack spread into a trucking invoice. It travels from a burning refinery in Siberia to a slightly higher number on a receipt in an American grocery store. The distance that used to protect everyone, the sheer physical remoteness of it all, is the thing that just stopped working. So the real question isn't whether Moscow can withstand another night of drones. It probably can. The question is whether the rest of us have been pricing in a war we assumed would stay in one place, right at the moment it decided it wouldn't. This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.